alter the terms under which labor organizing has occurred. So what the Ports campaign shows this development of sort of using local government law. In the Ports campaign, it was the ability of local governments to enact rules that govern the ability of trucking companies to access public property, concession agreements, to redefine the terms of employment and to promote unionization. So again, the shift is from sort of using traditional labor law to organize to thinking about local government law as a vehicle, a lever to actually promote union goals and more broadly to promote goals of reforming low-wage industries. So this is a broader pattern. Community labor coalitions systematically turn to local government law as a hook to wrest different types of labor enforcement policy. And they've done this precisely to avoid problems of federal labor law preemption. So they go to the local in order to avoid being preempted by federal labor law. Local governments couldn't just enact laws that directly regulated labor relations. They have to do it more indirectly in order to avoid federal preemption. So I don't, I think, have time to review all of them, but I do want to just point out that if you look at the outcomes of the campaigns that I pointed to at the beginning, almost all of them result at some point in local legislative reform that takes advantage of different types of local government powers, which I think is really important as a matter of the sort of shifting paradigm of labor law. Okay, so just a couple of points about, so these are sort of the basic local government law powers. These are the basic the powers that local governments have in order to influence economic activity within its jurisdiction. So local governments can contract, right? They can contract out services that would otherwise be undertaken directly by government staff, as in the case of bus transportation, janitorial services. They may award concessions to private companies, such as airport vendors, to operate businesses on publicly owned property, do lease or licensing arrangements. They can purchase supplies, such as uniforms for police officers from private companies. And these market interventions not only allow the city to conduct its business, but crucially they have direct impacts on the quality of jobs. Another power that's really key here is land use regulation. So land use authority remains the sort of heart of what local governments do, because every business basically requires some sort of land use permit in order to operate. So the core land use idea is sort of the zoning power, but it extends well beyond that. And a couple things that I just wanted to highlight here are two sort of land use related powers. One is the process of redevelopment, which is the sort of formal local government law process of designating land or areas, communities as quote unquote blighted, and then using the municipal power to take that property by eminent domain, and then transfer it to private developers for private development that then allows the city to capture increased property tax increment. So it's basically a process whereby local governments can sort of take property that they view as not being put to its highest use and then transfer it to private developers that they think will then put it to a higher and better use. The other thing that local government law regulation, land use regulation specifically relates to is this idea of conditional use permitting, which is something that's been used in these campaigns to create sort of hooks for local labor law reform. And conditional use permitting is a process under which a property owner can obtain permission for a land use not otherwise allowed as a matter of right by zoning law. So the classic example is that if you have an area that's zoned for residential use and you want a school in it, you have to get sort of a conditional use permit to allow the school to operate within that residential neighborhood. So it's a permit issued by the local government that allows a non-conforming use by permission. And then the city has sort of general police powers. It can always directly impose regulations to promote the public welfare, and sometimes uses those powers to advance local government, low-wage worker reform. So one thing I did was I looked at the sort of key low-wage worker initiatives that come out of the campaigns, and I'm going to show you a slide now that you're not going to be able to read, but I'll try to navigate you through it a little bit, and we can talk about some of the details in Q&A. But what it basically does is that it's a very small point, but over on the sort of left column, I identify different low-wage worker initiatives that have basically been passed or entered into since from 1997 up until about 2008. So So it starts with the Los Angeles Living Wage Ordinance. It then goes to a trio of community benefits agreements, which are agreements between local coalitions and private developers that are receiving public funds, and sort of specify terms of job hiring, living wage specifications, and some money for housing usually. There's a number of other ones. One is a superstore ordinance, which was passed around 2004, both in Inglewood and in Los Angeles in general, which basically says that if you're a big box retail store like Walmart, and you have a grocery, you have to undertake an economic impact report and mitigate any negative economic impacts as a condition of project approval. So you have to undergo a formal process of trying to figure out what kind of negative economic impacts the project would actually cause, and you have to take some steps to try to mitigate them. So that's the superstores ordinance. There's a sweat-free procurement ordinance that requires city contractors that produce garments, basically, to comply with applicable employment laws and actually to pay their workers at a living wage standard. Okay? This is the LA Enhancement Zone Ordinance, which was fairly recently passed and requires hotels in the LAX corridor area to pay a living wage. And the sort of unique thing about this living wage ordinance is that, unlike almost all the other ones in the United States, it applies to a specific geographic zone. So it says if you're a hotel in this zone, you have to pay living wage. Most of the other ones are tied to local government contracting. This one is the first, actually, I believe, in the country that it applies to a specific geographic zone and is untethered to local government relationships. A couple other ones. One is the Home Improvement Stores Ordinance, which is very much like the Superstores Ordinance, and was actually enacted after it, and it was built upon that model. And this basically says, if you're a big box home improvement store like Home Depot, you got to establish a site for day laborers as part of the conditional use permitting process. Right? So this was one that was organized through an individual organizing campaign. Day labor campaign got the city to pass this ordinance in order to secure sites for day laborers on Home Depot stores. So again, it's part of the conditional use permitting process. You've got to show how you're going to deal with day laborers and set up a site for day laborers as a way of getting approval. So the last two, one is called the CRA Construction Careers and Project Stabilization Policy, which is a project that is implemented through the Community Redevelopment Agency. This is specifically a redevelopment-oriented policy, and the Community Redevelopment Agency in LA, for those of you who don't know, engages in the process of redevelopment by designating land as blighted, taking it by eminent domain, and then transferring to private developers. It also ends up subsidizing a lot of development in low-income areas, particularly downtown. And so what this policy does is that it says that if the CRA is giving developers money, if it's providing a project with a subsidy of more than $500,000 in some cases, or $1 million in other cases, the developers actually have to hire locally and comply with certain targeted hiring standards. The last one is the Clean Trucks Program. This is the ports project that I just talked about. So it's focused on the modification of the shipping agreements at the ports. So these are the sort of low-wage worker initiatives that I identified through these campaigns. And again, all of them sort of interact with this local government law process in really important ways. And I'll make